Tomorrow marks exactly 1 week since 1/3 of the public service walked off the job on strike because of what their union says is a substandard offer from the federal government. The issue, as you heard there, continues to dominate debate in the House of Commons on Parliament Hill, and Canadians across this country continue to see delays when it comes to processing their passports, immigration services or hearings, and filing income taxes and potentially getting your return. So what will end this strike? Let's bring in MPs to talk about that. Greg Fergus is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasury Board President. Conservative Treasury Board critic Stephanie Koozie is here, and NDP Finance critic Daniel Blaikie is as well. Hi, everybody. Great to see you tonight. Thank you very much for making the time for this. Mr. Fergus, I'll start with you. Day 7, we've just said, has now come and gone of this strike. Why hasn't your government been able to get a deal?
Well, because they're still at the negotiating table. When these negotiations started, there were overall close to 600 demands which were put on the table. A lot of these irritants have been reduced, and we're down to the last handful. And the thing that I'm happy to say is that both parties are still at the table. They're negotiating in good faith, and I remain confident when both parties approach it with good faith that we'll come to a negotiated agreement.
Specifically on your level of confidence, I want to drill down on the wage issue, because that seems to be the primary sticking point, if not one of the two primary sticking points. Could your government afford more than a 9% raise if you hadn't contracted out so much of the services that the public service do, and at the same time increase the size of the public service? Could you afford the raise they're asking for if you hadn't done all of that?
Well, look, this is what we had to do. We were caught in an unusual times. As a matter of fact, it was an unparalleled times that we've had in over a century. We had a pandemic. And I'm really proud to say how the public service had stepped up to the plate and was able to provide Canadians with the support that they needed and the services they needed to get us through the pandemic. Now we're at a stage where we have to take a look at how the public service is going to be going forward and under what size, and how it's going to be making sure that it's taking advantage of some of the great innovations that have happened during the pandemic. So we'll see what it goes. The 9% that we've offered didn't come just out of thin air. It was a recommendation by the Public Interest Committee, which is a committee that takes a look at the government's demands and, of course, of the Labour demands, and comes up with a fair figure. So we're starting with that figure, and that's where we're at the table. And like I said, people are negotiating in good faith.
Respectfully, though, they made that figure, they came up with that determination that it was fair back at the beginning of February, I believe, so 2.5 months ago. Yet your government waited until just a few weeks ago to make that offer to the union. Does that not mean, or can you not understand how Canadians might see some culpability lying then with your government for the fact that we're in a strike now?
Well, no, don't forget, it takes two to tango. We were ready to be at the negotiating table, and unfortunately, the PSAC wasn't there. But when they did return to the negotiating table, things have been moving along at a good pace.
Okay, we'll just point out that PIC determination was made at the beginning of February. I'll move on, though, to your colleague, Ms. Koozie. I've listened to you and your party criticize the government for allowing this strike to happen, but I wanted to ask you very specifically, do you support the union's position? Do you believe the federal public service is entitled to a 13.5% raise over 3 years?
What we believe, Vashi, is that the fault of this strike rests completely on the shoulders of Justin Trudeau and his incompetent Liberal government. As you pointed out, they spent an additional $21 billion on the public service, in addition to 22 on outside consultants, and yet they weren't able to deliver services for Canadians. And now the Prime Minister has had 2 years to come to a negotiated agreement, and he failed to do that. So the strike that we see today is a result of the Prime Minister, his incompetence, and that it is his government.
Respectfully, Ms. Koozie, I understand the questions for the federal government and their role here, but my question is specifically on your party's position. Do you support PSAC's position that they would like to see a 13.5% raise over 3 years, that is commensurate with the rate of inflation, and it will help offset inflation for the federal public service? Should the government capitulate on that?
Vashi, we heard it from the Prime Minister in the opening clip. He is the one who is at the negotiating table, so he is the one who must evaluate what is necessary in an effort to end this strike. I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals, because this rests squarely on Justin Trudeau and his incompetent government.
I'm not absolving them in any way of their role in these negotiations, and you heard me question Mr. Fergus. I've questioned Minister Fortier multiple times on their position. I don't think it's a hypothetical, though, to ask, what the Conservative Party supports. You're very critical of the government, I understand that. Do you support the union's position that they should get a 13.5% raise? Why won't you answer that?
As long as the strike is ongoing, as long as they continue to be at the negotiating table, it is a hypothetical. And as such, we will rest the blame with the Prime Minister and with the Liberal government and their incompetence, Vashi.
Okay, I'm just going to register that that's not an answer to the direct question, but I understand the point you're making. Mr. Blaikie, I wanted to move over to you and ask you, I heard Mr. Singh very specifically call for the Prime Minister to insert himself in these negotiations, to involve himself, and like your colleague, Ms. Koozie, your party is pinning the blame on the Prime Minister here. What will him being involved in all of this actually accomplish?
Well, I think what we're starting to see from the union is a lot of criticism of Mona Fortier, and sometimes personalities do become a problem. So our view is that the Prime Minister getting involved might help overcome some of the issues that we're starting to hear about from the other side in respect of their principal bargaining partner. For us, what's important in these negotiations is a principle that's important not just for public sector workers, but for workers across the economy. Because so often the federal collective bargaining is taken as a benchmark for the entire economy. We think this is one of the sites of a fight for all workers to see inflation recognized in the wage increases they're going to get out of their employers. And we think that if the government forces a settlement that doesn't recognize inflation, 3 and 3 doesn't recognize that there's been incredible inflation over the last year or so, that's going to become a problem for workers across the economy when they go to their employer to say they want to see inflation recognized in their salary. They'll say, well, not even federal public servants got that, so we're not prepared to go that high.
But not everybody can afford recognizing the outsized impact of inflation, right? 9% is not nothing. It's not far, far away from 13.5%. I recognize that if you amortize inflation over the last 3 years, you'll arrive at 13.8%. How many people do you know that got a 13.8% raise? Inflation is not what it normally is, and it's heading back down. Isn't 9% fair, especially against the backdrop of a $40 billion deficit?
Look, I would point to some really outsized corporate profits in a number of industries. And there are corporations that can afford to pay their workers more.
That
and we believe that workers shouldn't be the ones to have to settle for a permanently lower quality of life. And in order not to, they need to see their wages keep pace with the pace of inflation.
But even when the government, I mean, a corporation that's making money is one thing, agreed. Mm-hmm. A corporation that's losing money, or a government that faces a $40 billion deficit, is that the same thing? I mean, this is why it's important
for collective bargaining to take place in specific workplaces, because the circumstances of all companies aren't the same. In the case of the federal government, that's seen as a leader when it comes to setting benchmarks for wages across the economy. We think it's important not just for public civil servants here in Ottawa and across the country, but for workers across the economy, that the federal government lead by example and show that it is possible for Canadians to get wage increases that are commensurate with inflation or somewhere near, so that workers across Canada aren't being told by their government, you need to get ready for a permanent decrease in the quality of life because your salaries will never come up to have the purchasing power that they used to.
Okay, I have time for one very quick final round, and I want to make sure I get everybody in. Mr. Fergus, I'm going to pick up right on Mr. Blaikie's point. Does he have a point there? Is the government prepared to move from 9%, yes or no?
Well, it's going to depend. I'm not at the negotiating table. I couldn't tell you exactly what are the things, but there are many elements which are going to lead to getting a deal. It's not only just on the issue of pay and compensation, but it's going to be under work conditions, pension benefits, ancillary health benefits. There's a whole bunch of stuff which is involved. So I think what you have to do is take a look at the package together. And look, right now, as everybody sees, when you're in negotiations, they're tough. That's what happens. But when people are at the table and they come to an agreement at the end, you'll stop hearing the hard words and you'll start seeing smiles and shaking hands, and we got to a deal that is reasonable for public workers and fair for Canadians.
I didn't hear a no to moving off of 9%. Ms. Koozie, your reaction to that?
My reaction is that it's Canadians who are paying the price for this strike. They're not receiving their passports. They have loved ones that are further tied up in immigration processes. And now there's complete uncertainty around tax time and when they will have their tax returns processed and when they will receive their refunds. So again, the Prime Minister's incompetence, the incompetence of this Liberal government, it's Canadians who pay the price in addition to the public service, Vashi.
9% wasn't a no, Mr. Blaikie. It also wasn't a yes, and you heard Mr. Fergus say it's a suite of measures. Does he have a point there? Can you offset perhaps not a 13.5% raise with a lot of other stuff that the unions?
Well, there's certainly a lot else going on, and I think one of the ways that Minister Fortier exacerbated the situation was in December with the back to the office order. The government clearly wasn't prepared for that. We've heard stories about workers who came back to work to find that they didn't have a desk, they didn't have a computer. We know that during the pandemic there was a huge increase in the size of the civil service, but because of remote work, folks weren't always hired in the same city that their office is in. So for a number of workers, that means being ordered back to an office that isn't in the city that they live in. That's a major problem. So I think the government should show flexibility around work from home. That was not the tone they took in December. It was a very hard line about coming back to the office. If that's what's getting in the way of ending the strike and getting services back to being available for Canadians, I think the government should show flexibility on that point as a way of getting a deal. And that could include a longer rollout of getting workers to come back to the office. But if that's one of the impediments, I don't know, I'm not at the table. I think, we just had a couple of years with a pretty flexible work from home schedule. If we got to do that for a little bit longer to get a deal and get folks back to work right now, I don't like to think that that's one of the impediments to ending the strike.
We'll see. I mean, their letter